G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far a great week. I hope the Sunday blues haven't got you too bad heading into the working week. Now I know the last few videos have been long, we're going to try and shorten them up, but there's a lot to talk about as always, and there's always a lot of context that needs to be added, and I think that is very important. But that's the beauty of YouTube, is we can talk here for as long as we want, not try and cram it into a small Twitter post or into a 2-minute segment on the news. That's why this is taking over. But today we're going to look at the maps and a few things of what we thought that we would see that we are starting to see. We need to talk about what Viktor Orban has said in a speech as well. There's some interesting pieces in that, and it links to some of the other bits we've spoken about as far as the developing multipolar world and how he sees the EU and the American influence there. Two, we need to talk about China. Now, of course, Ukraine's foreign minister was with Yang Hui, who's the foreign minister for China, then last week. And we'll look at then what Russia has said about this and maybe some contradiction in statements. But straight off the bat, what I want to talk about is there are a lot of large claims coming out from Ukraine that several aircraft have been destroyed, both bombers, fighter jets, choppers, a bit of everything. Now, as I always say, wait for visual confirmation. There are cameras on everything from your fridge to your phone to your drone. There's satellites overhead, absolutely, that want to get this for the propaganda victory and the strategic victory of taking out important aircraft like this. Wait for that before we say this has been taken down. So we have again got from the Ukrainian intelligence services this from claims of the helicopters. But again, this footage here, for me, it's just not clear enough to say that that has been taken down. If Russia released that footage saying that this was sabotage against Ukrainian choppers, what would you say? Exactly. Both ways on this, we know there are a lot of false claims from Russia and from Ukraine about weapon systems or systems being destroyed. It's part of the larger informational war going on. As well, we have then this from Ukrainian Pravda saying the GUR drones hit a strategic bomber of the Russian Federation at then this airfield. They had a long-range strategic bomber, a Tu-22M3, which is the newer modified variant, was hit. Again, wait to see. I'll believe any claim once there is legitimate, beyond reasonable doubt, evidence that this then occurred. Now, of every strike, we're not going to be able to get that. So there will be some that occur that we don't. But the vast majority in a war of 2024, where we have all of these assets to prove it, give it a couple of days. And if it doesn't come out, I bring that then into question. So let's then have a look at the maps and see where things are changing. But before we step right onto the maps, I want to have a look at this, of what was sent across to me from a follower of mine. Now, this bloke is one of the field commanders in Donetsk. Now, he has put then on Telegram, some channels write the demobilisation of some of our mobilised personnel is planned for the fall, as well as rotation of units that have been in action for a long time. The demobilisation figures are said to be substantial, up to 150,000, which is approximately half of the last mobilisation. On the other hand, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is already an unannounced fact, and only the timing of its start varies. But anyway, we are most likely talking about autumn. I'm trying to solve this puzzle, but so far nothing good comes to mind. One thing catches your eye. While they are out there, they being Ukraine, catching everyone on the streets who is not hiding in order to throw them into the meat grinder, we are planning the opposite. From an informational and propaganda point of view, this is a good move. Now, I want to know what you think of this here, that this guy is claiming that there is going to be a large demobilisation of Russian forces and that the Ukrainian counteroffensive then next year will happen. I've seen people behind the scenes go, is there something known that there will be maybe an end to the hot war at the end of the year, and that there is getting ready for, through the messaging we're seeing, demobilisation of troops, moving away. Again, I don't know. That was interesting. Many people said to me that they were calling it bullshit until they saw then him post it. So again, grain of salt with everything, but we will then see. So let's have a look on the map. So here is Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, what we have been speaking about down in Donetsk, Avdiivka front is that they're going to go, they being the Russians, are going to go urban center to urban center, and by this, then it will become indefensible for then some of the open ground. Now, we first spoke about this, I believe, about 4 to 5 months ago, when a friend of mine on the ground in Semenivka back here sent me some photographs and his opinion on the terrain happening here. And what he was saying is the open ground here is so hard to defend. It's flat, it's open. There's some dead ground, but not that much, that there will be envelopments, but the open ground will fall. Russia will not be able to move through that, so they'll have to sort of go around it. But Ukraine being in that is going to be very difficult then as well. And this is what we are seeing. And today is no separate to this. Today we do see then a large advancement from Russia through then these open ground. And what we have seen is then the fall of these open grounds in here. But this is due to what we have seen for Russia push from Sokil, then Novoselivskaya Persha, so urban center, Ulmansky, Yasnoborivka, and then in between here. I think we will see within the next few weeks that there will be a complete Ukrainian withdrawal back then across the Volcha River. Now, yesterday we spoke about where the Ukrainian defensive works are in here and where this could speed up or slow down for then the Russian offensive. But again, down in here is looking worse and worse now that there is confirmed Russian gain by this map right up Yasnoborivka. I don't know if you could come out of anywhere here. So it is looking like whatever forces are in here, and we know there's got to be some forces because this hasn't then fallen. Why would Russia not move up if there isn't? Maybe have to move back out of here, and how that will look, we are then unsure. But you can see all the way to Novoselivskaya Persha that this has then come under Russian control, and that out from the Vesely front here, that Russia is pushing next to Zeleny as well. So large advancements again around the Avdiivka front, pushing down on the train line here, and we could see in Zeleny then a larger movement back of a step back of the Ukrainian forces here as the Russians are continually then stepping forward in this front. Now let's compare this to a couple of different maps. This is then the Syriac map update. Now here's showing same region around the Yasnoborivka front, but I actually believe he's showing less between Yasnoborivka and Novoselivskaya Persha. So again, similar, but we 100% know there's been movement there. And again, both maps are showing this movement out near Zeleny as well. So again, we know this movement then took place. Russian army continued advance along the railway and entered the southern part of Vesely and reached the northern outskirts of Zeleny. Meanwhile, Russian forces began to capture the last section of the eastern shore of the Volcha River under Ukrainian army control by advancing west of Ulmansky. So again, this is an area I think to definitely watch, and I wouldn't be surprised. We may see it just grind forward as we have seen, but we could see a large step as well. Now, that grind forward, that links in with the doctrine, about then attritional warfare, that you don't want to end up outside of your bubble of influence. If you end up with a 10-kilometer advancement spire somewhere and the artillery, your electronic warfare and other supporting elements can't then keep your forward troops within that bubble of protection influence, then you really risk getting cut off. And this is why a lot of your old thunder runs and this or that in a modern warfare, attritional like this, with so many other elements that come in as drones, EW may not work, or the risk of this is incredibly high. Of course, the risk was high when there wasn't drones. Now with drones and EW, way, way higher again. So this is interesting to look at. And this is what people have this idea of, well, Russia isn't winning fast enough, that at this rate it's going to take 20 years to reach Kyiv. That's not how attritional, protracted war works. It's grind, 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 and then you may have a collapse in a large step. But on the other side of that, that it could be that Ukraine is having this step back, step back, step back, wearing down the Russians too. And this is something that we don't know when we do not have reliable numbers of what losses are occurring on the front line. Is it 10 to 1 like Ukraine will claim? Is it 2-1 as Russia may claim, or 3-1 as we don't know. If we had that number, we could have then a better opinion on, is Ukraine having a step back to better positions, wearing down the Russians and making them have massive losses, or is Russia having the small step forwards within their bubble of influence and grinding down then defensive works to try and eventually get behind defensive works where you see then a large movement. That is what I call the bankruptcy tactic, that it's little by little and then all at once. But any movement in this war, any movement is going to come at incredibly high cost. And how high of a cost can you actually afford? And that is the question I ask about any main centers of influence, whether it is Kramatorsk, whether it is Kharkiv, but on the flip side, whether it is Donetsk or Sevastopol too. But we're going to come down to where we've seen Russia, of course, have a very high cost of any advancement. And this is the Vuhledar front, where we saw that massive armoured assault where Russia lost a lot of troops and a lot of armour. But today it is being confirmed that they have made some ground in this direction. And I said at the time, they've got large losses here, but I do not see in any area of this front line with drones and the artillery, with everything, I don't see how any movement by either side here is going to move any differently to this, regardless of going there north or south or east or then west. And then this, I believe, is then backed up by a Syriac map here, yes, showing the same advancement along then the road, but he's showing just up to then the Horovka, then front near Konstantinivka, up in here. I was going to say it looked different to me, that there was a Russian advancement here too. Now, one thing we've said is this front and where the grey zone is sitting is very different as far as this reservoir is here near Paraskovskia, that Syriac is saying that the Russians are right on the border of Konstantinivka, where that maybe the grey zone is here, but he's saying it's actually presence there. But again, large losses to make some amount of gain, and this is where this war is sitting. This is attritional war. Are your losses versus what you're getting then sustainable? And people online who will say it's not, unless they've got someone telling them what the losses actually are, what the industrial capacity actually is, not what is maybe released through some mainstream, but what it really is. It's very hard to try and extrapolate out then 6-12 months of how that will go. Same with the West picking up their industrial capacity, and as well as people talk about Russia will run out of tanks on this day. Now, some of those dates have been and gone, but as well, what if they just buy tanks from China? Or I'm not saying tanks is just an example, but again, it's a very fluid war, what is happening at the moment, but it's fluid, politics fluid, whatever. Front line is a grind, regardless of where this would move. Now, let's then come just to the west of here. We'll come down to Robotny. Now, no changes down in here. Now, many different maps show vastly different from what we're seeing then on this map today. Syriac is then, of course, no different to this. So this is the road here that is running down here. So he is saying that right up in here has been taken by the Russians, including the rest of Robotny. Now, there are Ukrainian maps that also then show this as well. What I've said in here is this was one of the most costly areas for the Ukrainian offensive in 2023, and I think that it is in the informational benefit to not show the Russian advancement through here and the recapturing of their own defensive line. That is what I've said. That's my, I guess, excuse being made for why this hasn't been shown, although there are geolocated footage images of the Russians in here, as well as other pro-Ukrainian, even NATO maps showing vastly different to this. So let's look in some other then fronts. So Krasnoyarivka, and here you can see some red confirmed then Russian advancement beyond then the green center here, which is what then Syriac has showed for, I want to say, about a week. Now he, of course, is showing this is the green center here. He's shown that this has been under control for a while, but he's showing that the remainder part of Krasnoyarivka here has come under control in the north here too. Of course, there's still some areas, but the main sort of body of that coming under control. But on the northeast is still looking very different. Russian army continue advancing, reaching the last streets, the core part of the town. On the other hand, Ukrainian army re-entered the town from the south following another counterattack. So down in the south, down in here, that Ukraine had then re-entered just down in where my cursor is here, still shown as grey zone on this map. No change on where that offensive is. And we have actually seen there's been multiple then counterattacks down on the south of Krasnoyarivka here as well. So we'll see and we'll continue tracking how then that changes over the next coming weeks and or months. Now, no changes shown on Bakhmut here, but then Syriac does have an update for us just to the north. So if we look where Privilia is, it's Privilia. So this tree line that it is showing that the Russians had an advancement right up to about this tree line out to the north, reactivated this axis, taking control of a series of positions. Again, grain of salt, it's not confirmed over then multiple different maps. We know Russia is pushing very hard near Pesheni here as well. This map hasn't shown an update for a couple of days. Syriac over the last few days has said that there is a northern push out of here, and they confirmed this again today. Situation northeastern front, Russian army continues securing the northern heights of Peshani. So he's saying that there is then this continual push out to the north, vastly different from where then this map is showing today. So again, it's difficult to know exactly what then is happening. He's saying that basically through here, so right where my cursor is now under Russian control. Again, we will wait and see, and eventually it will come out of exactly where then this is sitting. Now, we've been speaking about a lot of politics recently: China, India, the US, Russia, Ukraine, everyone, but a lot of China and India. Now, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister for the Russian Federation, he has then come out with this today, and there's some interesting bits in this I want to talk about. But Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said today he does not listen to what is called Ukraine's contradictory statements on peace talks. Lavrov spoke after Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba visited China for talks this week. President Volodymyr Zelensky then said Beijing sent a clear signal it supported Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, we spoke of these meetings, I want to say 3 videos ago. It should be pretty obvious. I think it's in the thumbnail if you want to go back and have a look at this. And we said at the time, I don't think from what we're seeing that this is a clear signal. So this is what Zelensky came out with, and this is what we sort of picked that going down the route. And okay, what did the Chinese say? The Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is visiting China these days, held talks. There is a clear signal that China supports Ukraine in territorial integrity and sovereignty. It's also confirmed what Chinese leader Xi Jinping told me, that China will not supply weapons to Russia. That's from what Zelensky said. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs said very similar on their website. And then at the time, we went to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to see what was said. Because if China is supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, 1991 borders, which is implied, I believe, by that, and then sovereignty of all that too, that changes then the war. But this was what then the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out on their website, which you can find. They're friendly countries to each other, and the two sides have a friendship and cooperation. That Ukraine is one of the first countries to participate in the joint construction of the Belt and Road. Third year, conflict is ongoing with the risk of escalation, and they're promoting a political solution to the crisis, which is what they've talked about. Xi Jinping's for shoulds. This is the 6-point consensus, which we actually looked at in yesterday's video as well with Brazil. But then it was critiqued by the US and Ukraine not to go down then the route that Brazil and China came to. Gathering the greatest common denominator of international community, received widespread response and support, eventually returned to the negotiating table, and Ukraine and Russia have sent signals of willingness to negotiate in varying degrees, the constructive role in ceasefire and resumption of peace talks. But what I said at the time, and what I'll say again, is, to me, in the statements given here, now, of course, there's behind-the-scenes talks, there's non-publicised stuff, I get that, but it doesn't seem that China in these meetings did say that they support then the return of that territory either. And the China-Brazil 6-point plan also doesn't say that either, and that's saying what the ministry support. So, yeah, again, that's what I'm saying. And Lavrov had obviously pointed to this as well. Lavrov referred dismissively to Zelensky and Kuleba's comments, which sought to paint himself as a mediator after Russia's invasion, respected Ukraine's territorial integrity. Kuleba is saying, not for the first time, and sometimes said completely opposite things. That's what Lavrov has said. He also said not long ago they were talking about negotiations, Zelensky of readiness to finally sit at a table with Russian representatives. I did not listen to them. So Kuleba himself has spoken to Wang Yi, who's the same bloke that then Kuleba from Ukraine spoke to. And in this, he sensed that the Chinese position remains unchanged. He said Beijing insists the format of any peace talks must be acceptable to both sides. About Trump, I've heard that he proposed, instead of giving Ukraine money, to allocate $500 billion on lend-lease conditions, calling this the approach of a businessman. But I can't comment on numerous ideas that aren't really serious. A massive grain of salt in that. But he's also said, when there is something serious proposed, of course, as the president said, we are always ready for an honest conversation, taking into the realities that exist now. And what Russia is saying on these realities that exist is they're saying the reality that exists on the ground is the sanctions were not as useful as then you thought, as well as we are making advancements on the ground. And if they go to the negotiating table, that needs to be taken into account. And the bargaining chips at the negotiating table that Russia has is then all of the ground that they currently then occupy in Ukraine. So speaking of Wang Yi from China, busy guy, again, that he has spoken then with the US as well. Now, Secretary Blinken's meeting with the People's Republic of China, director of the CCP Foreign Affairs Office, Wang Yi. This is what we need to talk about, of how this then relates to China supplying stuff to Russia and what has been said here. China's disabling action in the South China Sea, so a lot of Taiwan stuff. The Secretary Blinken reiterated serious concern with China's support for Russia's defense industrial base and made clear that if China does not act to address this threat to European security, the United States will continue to take appropriate measures to do so. Two sides recognise the importance of maintaining open lines of communication between each other. So concern about China supplying dual-use items, military items to Russia. Now, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs then has released this on their website as well. This is Wang Yi. This is Antony Blinken here. He, to the first part of that, said that Taiwan is part of China and will never be a country. Each time Taiwan independence forces make provocation, we will definitely take countermeasures and work towards complete reunification. So keep out for that in the next months or years. We have no idea if and or when that will happen. But speaking on Ukraine, said China's position on the Ukraine issue is fair and transparent, and China will continue to encourage and promote peace talks. The US side should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and the long arm of jurisdiction. China has criticised the US and the UN before for using or weaponizing sanctions. China rejects false accusations and will not succumb to pressure or blackmail. China will take resolute and robust measures to protect its major interests and legitimate rights. So very interesting, going to push back on this as well. China has been pretty steadfast that we're not giving military support to Russia. We're seeing some elements rock up in Russia, but my take is absolutely China is interested in this war. I think they've got the most to benefit of any nation from then this war, and they're looking at lessons learned, failures, successes, probably most likely supplying ISR from satellites and everything to Russia, whether Russia's buying that or not. Then, yeah, if China enter the war, it will be a very, very different situation than on the front line. Very, very unlikely they'll enter the war in some level of like military stance, but could be more open to sending Russia more equipment and or then making more equipment open for availability of purchase by Russia as well, if things started coming down on the availability of in Russia's own industrial base. But at this point in time, we don't really know. But what I was getting at there is there's definitely still a lot of friendship between Russia and China. Of course, China and America, there's always going to be a lot of friction there as China's influence in the world continues to grow. And to point out differences in maybe some messaging too. So Viktor Orban, of course, from Hungary, has had a speech and some very controversial bits said, but I think it's very interesting to go through this. Now, I could not find on the internet anywhere an actual transcript of this speech. So I apologize. We're going through some different news sources, from translated from Hungarian, translated from Russian, translated from Ukrainian, and some in English too, to get an idea of what was said. So if I do misquote what exactly was said, I apologize. If you can find this somewhere, please let me know. But there's some interesting, very interesting parts in this. Parts I agree with, parts I disagree with. The Prime Minister's speech reflected tension with Brussels, particularly over the EU's stance on the Ukrainian conflict. He criticised the EU for what he sees as contradictory policies that support war under the guise of seeking peace, saying Brussels wants to create peace by continuously supporting the war. He remarked, however,
despite the initial resistance, there is a growing shift towards peace-oriented approach within European politics. But we've also spoken why that the war in Ukraine, supporting that war in Ukraine, can at least delay other elements of Russian influence in other areas of then the world. Focusing on three main themes, the Prime Minister discussed the unforeseen consequences of the post-war world and how Hungary should prepare for an emerging global order, something we've spoken about a lot with the rise of a multipolar world. The PM used a metaphor from the film The Matrix to illustrate the stark realities revealed by the war. The war is our red pill form. He suggested the brutal losses on both sides of this conflict highlight the importance of external intervention for peace, asserting that both Russia and Ukraine are driven by their own perceived truths and ambitions. It is up to the two parties. There will be no peace. It must be brought from the outside. So Russia and Ukraine, they're not going to find the peace. Someone over the top needs to make the influence for that then to occur. He described the conflict as a proxy war involving the US and Russia, with Ukraine's newfound alignment with the West giving it a renewed sense of purpose, saying, since the beginning of my peace mission, Western leaders have held talks, things are brewing, and we're slowly shifting to a peace-oriented European policy. And we have seen, like I've been saying for all these videos, messaging is changing. He praised Russia's economic resilience and adaptability, saying everyone has a plan, quoting Mike Tyson until they get punched in the mouth, and Russia's unexpected resilience in the face of sanctions. And that is true. Russia was far more resilient to sanctions than we thought. The concern for that is it does mean that our influence on their economy was significantly less than we thought it was. And can we then translate that of how much is our influence on China's economy or other countries' economies for sanctions? The Russians have adapted, become one of the world's largest producers. The Prime Minister laminated the collapse of the European politics, accusing the continent of sacrificing its core interests for the sake of following the USA's foreign policy. The European policy has collapsed. Europe has given up defending its interests and follows the USA's foreign policy unconditionally. He pointed out the traditional power axis of Paris-Berlin has been supplanted by a new London-Warsaw-Kyiv axis, reshaping Europe's geopolitical landscape. So talking that the US influence in Europe is so much that it's actually countering what maybe Europe's policies and politics then are and what their core interests are. And we have spoken about that the US need influence into Europe and Asia, so they're coming in, and with the EU and NATO and this and that, Europe, the EU, NATO need security, so of course they want to have ties with Russia, not to become just an arm, say, of Asia, Middle East. So it's a very hard balance there. And of course, the US has a lot more power inside of Europe than I believe they've ever had, of course, with then the Ukrainian war. Now, in a speech, he forecasts a shifting global power away from the irrational West towards Asia and Russia. In the next long decades, maybe centuries, Asia will be the dominant center of the world, mentioning China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, so the global south. And we have spoken then about this, not only from replacement rate, but then emerging economies and populations, what ties into that replacement rate, of course, but then the immigration of the global south into countries in the west too could change then the demographics there, that there is a shift in global power. Will it be that there will be a larger power? Again, I don't believe that matters as long as nuclear weapons are in the play, that people go, well, who would win, China or America? It doesn't matter whose tank force would win in a hot war between major powers like this anymore. It's the law of diminishing returns. It makes no sense to then add another 1,000 nukes. It doesn't matter if that then makes sense. But we are seeing a rise in the global then south, and we've spoken at length about this. Discussing Western decline, Orban argued the West has forsaken the concept of nation states, embracing post-national mentality. The West's goal is to surpass the nation, transferring sovereignty from nation states to Brussels. So instead of, say, Hungary having then its sovereignty, that then it's transferred into the wider EU. He stressed the importance of maintaining national sovereignty, culture, moral standards, contrasting with the West's acceptance of multiculturalism and migration. But this is part of the EU. Being in the EU, you do sacrifice some of your nation's sovereignty, at least at maybe the federal level, for the economic, financial and safety net of being in the EU. Same as Australia still being under the king. That we, yes, sacrifice some of that sovereignty, but we're tied then to this too. So it's a very hard balance here. In the Western mindset, the nation states no longer exist. In our understanding, nation states have roots in specific culture and biblical foundation. And I should add to, with the nation states too, this is what Kissinger talked to at length about losing that independence in the EU too. And there's been a lot of speakers I listened to recently talk that they reckon they're actually seeing the end of the EU over the next few decades because of there are countries with such polar opposing ideas of what it means for sovereignty and for the future of Europe. And of course, so much of this is based in multiculturalism and migration that people are not happy with. And people are not happy with that across Europe, I believe, as well, across then the Western world. Now, the Prime Minister also highlighted Donald Trump's efforts, saying the experiment is the USA's last chance to maintain world leadership. The US ambassador to Hungary has had a real hit back at this to it, but I don't have it on me. But this links into this change. Change is coming and not seen for the 500 years. We're facing, in fact, a world order change. He also talked at Nord Stream gas pipeline, calling it an act of terrorism carried out by the obvious direction that of the Americans. Now, Nord Stream, and it says he didn't offer any evidence to back up the claim. We know that Nord Stream, if you look at who is to benefit the most from this, it's not then Russia. And I think one of the most telling things is all the investigations. No, we didn't find anything, or the investigation just closed. And the Western world having one of the largest, if not the largest, man-made the environmental disaster, who are obsessed with then this and drinking out of paper straws and this and that, have that, and they're just completely, nothing happened. Interesting. Anyway, I think that's basically evidence then enough. On Ukraine, Orban cast doubt on whether the war-torn country becoming either a member of NATO or EU, saying, "We Europeans do not have the money for it. Ukraine will revert to the position of a buffer state," adding the international security guarantees will be enshrined in an agreement between the US and Russia, so that Ukraine won't join any of these because of the rebuilding cost or the rearming cost of this, or the cost of a larger war if Russia then don't stop, that they'll have an agreement and then the US and Russia will back that up like other agreements we have seen prior. But again, we don't know. We know the messaging from all the leaders, the majority of the leaders, is that Ukraine's future is in NATO, it is in the EU. I've said at length, with what I see on the ground at the moment, my prediction would be Ukraine will join the EU. Russia, it seemed like in the Turkey negotiations in 2022, had no problem with EU, but it did have a problem with NATO. Now, with the reality on the ground, what I'm seeing, unless there's major shifts, if the war was to have some peace settlement this year, I think we'd see Ukraine within the next few years join the EU. NATO, I think there's still a large question mark over that. But legends, I hope that you've had a fantastic weekend. I hope that you have a good week at work or school or whatever you do. Look after yourself. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.